Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
We hope you enjoy listening to this podcast of St. Louis on the Air, brought to you by University College at Washington University. With undergraduate and graduate programs, part-time, evening, and online. University College at Washington University, offering world-class education within reach.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Don Marsh. The fact that we can now do in our homes what once required professional help is hurting some industries. The recording industry in St. Louis is a case in point. How and why is detailed in a documentary film that is featured in this year's Cinema St. Louis Filmmakers Showcase. It's titled Gateway Sound and will be shown this Saturday. Joining me to talk about it is Justin Fisher. He is the producer and director of Gateway Sound. He's also a professional audio engineer with Smith Lee Productions and an adjunct professor at Webster University. Justin, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, tell me what's changed in the world of studio sound recording that would inspire an hour-long documentary.
What hasn't changed, I guess, is the more important question. The biggest thing, and we go into this a lot in the documentary, is technology, just in the broad sense. Everything from what medium we record onto, tape versus hard drive now, and even how we deliver materials. So, in the old days, you'd have to FedEx somebody or UPS somebody a big old box of tapes from the mix engineer to the mastering engineer, and now we use Dropbox and things like that. So, every aspect from recording to actually getting it to the consumer is completely different.
With today's technology, I understand, and it's certainly pointed out in your documentary, which I enjoyed, by the way,
Thank you,
is the fact that a lot of musicians and groups and what have you can now do the sort of thing they used to do in your studio in their bedroom or garage.
Yeah, and the funny thing is home studios have never... We haven't had a time where there really hasn't been home studios. Not that part hasn't changed. Les Paul had a home studio in his car, and he'd take a recorder from hotel room to hotel room and record. But now the difference is we have better quality and a cheaper price point. Even though in the past a lot of people could still have access to recording at home, the price of entry was still pretty high, so not everybody...
In the price of the equipment they had to buy?
Exactly,
is that what you mean? Yeah,
yes. Okay. So, buying a tape machine, in 20, 30 years ago, if you bought a 16-track or an 8-track tape machine, might set you back, a few grand. Mm-hmm. Well, now you might still pay a few grand, but that's on your laptop. And everybody has a laptop. You just have to buy a little recording interface, and that might set you back $100. And the software now is, you can get software for free, and Audacity is one that you can get for free, and there's many other cheaper options too.
It would seem to me, though, that the loss would offset the gain in a sense, in terms of what people are able to do outside of a studio.
To a certain extent, I mean, it is still always going to come down to the talent, and that's the one thing that we kind of drive home in the documentary too, is that just because you can do it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a good product. But that doesn't mean that a good product can't come out of home studios. Of course, that's ridiculous, because there's many great recordings that people sometimes don't even know were done in home studios. So I do think that it's a situation where you can't blame the technology necessarily, but it's definitely a factor.
Mm-hmm. Are the musicians coming in? That is, are singers and other musicians coming to you in fewer numbers these days as a result of all of this?
Yeah, but that's not necessarily an issue of the home studios per se. Like I said earlier, home studios have always been around. I think each city is going to be a little unique. St. Louis has a lot of recording studios for the size of the city. So, some studios may kind of like focus on a certain type of music or a certain type of work. You might have some studios that just do corporate work, or some studios that do just music or just a certain type of music. So the combination of the amount of studios, the fact that people are recording at home too, and also the fact that not everybody is doing everything at the studio as well. Like, you should really probably do drums in a recording studio, because the space has so much to do with the sound of the recording, and that's everything. But you might not need to do bass at a recording studio, or maybe not vocals at a recording studio, So
Don't you want to have them all together, though, if they're the single group?
In theory, yes. It's going to be music genre dependent. So like a hip hop song is going to have a lot different requirements than a jazz tune, So that's a big factor too. You'd pretty much always want to have people that are doing jazz together, playing as a group. But if you're just doing vocals for a track, it's not necessarily the case.
What difference is this making for the consumer? I'm thinking that most of us today are listening to whatever we're listening to with earbuds or on our telephones or maybe our laptop. The speakers are small, no woofers and tweeters as once was the case.
That's very correct. And I think that also kind of smooths over the fact that maybe the recordings might not always be as good. It won't matter as much. When you do have those situations where people are listening, I'm astonished at the amount of people that listen to music exclusively on their phones. And I'm not even talking through earbuds. I just mean on the phone speaker, which is crazy, or their laptop. So the low end is like totally just gone. It doesn't exist. But the funny thing is the way that people are streaming, or the way that people are getting music is through streaming now, mostly. And the digital algorithms kind of lose some low end too, especially if you're going Bluetooth. Bluetooth is horrible for that. And so that loses a lot of low end as well. So, the fidelity isn't there as it used to. People would pride themselves on their home theaters and their home studio, or on their home entertainment systems, and have big standing speakers and all that.
What about the ability to manipulate the music in the various parts and layer the music? You mentioned Les Paul. I guess he got that all started with multiple track recording. How much of that can be done outside of a studio now?
The capabilities of putting a song together, the capabilities of a mix can equally be done anywhere. It's not really an issue. It's mostly when you go to a studio, you're dealing with better acoustics, usually better equipment, maybe microphones and preamps and all that stuff to make the sound more full. But also the biggest factor is the person doing it. The engineer. So you might have someone doing that job literally every day, all day, and it's gonna factor into the recording.
How so? I mean, you make a big point of this in the film. How important is the engineer, and is it so much important than me working my laptop once I get pretty good at it?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about knowing how to get good sounds. Knowing where to put the microphone is everything, and certain. Knowing what microphone to use or where to place it is everything. I mean, the mix, doing things afterwards in post-production, there's always things that we can do to fix it afterwards. But it's that old phrase, garbage in, garbage out. If you start with a great recording from the beginning, there's less that you have to do afterwards.
Let's go back a few years and talk about the way you were doing this, let's say, 20 years ago. Were you at a point, and you may not have been doing it then, you don't look old enough maybe to go back quite that far, but what was being done then, let me put it that way? Was that roughly equivalent to what can be done in the garage today with the laptop?
Not really. I mean, 20 years ago was really a transitional period because digital was still in its infancy. So you had a lot of places still using tape, but a lot of places that were doing digital tape-based systems, DATs and ADATs and things like that. So the sound wasn't great, but it was a high cost of entry for a lot of people. But you were still recording on a physical medium, on some sort of tape-based device. And the tracks were very limited. You might spend $2,500 on 8 tracks, and now we spend that on unlimited tracks.
How many tracks would be typical for a typical recording today? Let's just say a small jazz group.
16-ish, but if we go start adding a bunch of vocals and stuff like that and stack things up, that can increase that. But we can do a rock band that might have 200 tracks or something, or a film that might have 200 plus tracks.
200 tracks. What in the world would you put on 200 tracks?
Many people say that more tracks doesn't always equal better, and sometimes equals worse. Yeah. But listening to the sound of modern recordings now is quite different than listening to something in the 80s or the 70s. Anybody can just compare those two types of recordings, and they're totally different, and a lot goes into making things sound that way. Overall, is the sound quality going to be better on tape as opposed to a digital format? Oh, that's the question of the ages that still hasn't been answered. It's a subjective thing. A lot of people prefer the sound of tape, and I think that's kind of why we see a vinyl resurgence. Well, that's what I was getting to, yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're two very different things. And I think with the vinyl thing, it's more of I don't want to say a novelty, but I want to say a nostalgic thing and a physical connection to that music as well. You take the time and you sit down and you listen, and you have an image to look at and the credits. And all of that stuff is in front of you, and it takes more care. And you, I think, in a way, respect the music more that way. Mm-hmm. But obviously, there's a sound difference. Everybody's got their opinions about it. I don't personally care for the sound of vinyl that much. Mm-hmm. It's very harsh. There's not as much low end as you would get from a digital medium. But I don't think that really matters. Apparently not. You hear an awful lot about this resurgence of vinyl mm-hmm. lately. I don't quite get it myself, but people who know more about it than I do swear by it. Yeah, I don't really care why people do it, but I'm excited that they do, because it gets people interested and excited in music and the art of listening to music rather than having it in the background. And anything that leads to that, in my opinion, is a good thing. Of course, one of the problems today with all of that is you have to have some place to play that vinyl, and there aren't many record players around anymore. Yeah. I mean, you're seeing a lot of cheap ones come around, but not a lot of the good stuff. It's just still, again, that's a high cost of entry as well for a good record player. Sure. What about, you bring this up in the film, the issue of collaboration, the fact that people who are do-it-yourselfers mm-hmm. don't have the ability to work with others, as it were? Yeah, and working by yourself, you don't have other opinions or somebody to say, oh, hey, that maybe's not a great idea, or maybe we can make it better by doing this. Any art, maybe short of painting, mm-hmm. you're going to bounce ideas off of someone, and hopefully someone will give you constructive criticism. And in the studio, it's kind of that same way, but also you have people that have been doing it for a while, and they say, hey, we could really make this sound cool by doing this. Mm-hmm. So it's a band just inherently by itself is the same scenario. As a guitar player, I might not have the best idea of how to play the bass or play the drums a certain way to really make the sound pop. But having those other members of the band contributing to the writing process will take it to the next level. What is gained on the part of musicians who go the do-it-yourself route? I mean, there must be pluses because they're doing it. Money. Yeah, of course. It's obviously a big one. The ability to kind of work at your own pace. Let's face it, everybody's got a day job, and financially not everyone's doing great these days, I don't think. So getting into a studio can be costly. I mean, it's much cheaper and more affordable than it is nowadays, than it ever has been.
Because of this insurgence.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this in the film too, but the studio rates have dropped drastically. At our studio, I work at Smithley Productions, and back in the 80s, we could charge $100-something an hour. Mm-hmm. And now we usually charge anywhere from $75 to $50 an hour, depending on the project, which is usually about the going rate of not only everyone in St. Louis, but across the country. I've had plenty of producers come in flying from L.A. and be like, oh, the cost of studios in L.A. is not any different than it is here. Mm-hmm. So it's, that has evened out across the board.
So where is it all going? I mean, ultimately, are we looking at a time when people will just be doing it themselves, or will there always be a need for the sound studio?
I don't think so. I think people still are going to studios a lot now. It's just there's more people, I think, making music now. I don't have any facts to base that on, but just under my impression, because you have so many more people that have access to instruments, and YouTube is showing people how to play. They don't have to go necessarily. It's not the greatest idea, but they don't necessarily have to go to somebody to learn how to play an instrument. I think a lot of people got into the art of music by video games like Rock Band and Guitar Hero and things like that. So a lot more people, I think, are playing and making electronic music and things like that. So you have many more people who might want to get into a studio, and they might not do their whole project there, but a studio can help in certain aspects. Maybe, hey, come over and record just your drums at the studio, and I'll give you the files and you finish it at home. Or maybe you want to record your vocals on a really nice microphone. Come into the studio, we'll do it there.
I suspect that what this is doing also is bringing more people into the field, that is, as performers, because it is a little less expensive. They can mess around with it themselves. So what is that doing to the quality of music that's out there these days?
That's a long discussion in and of itself, and you have opinions around the board of, how things sound now. The biggest thing for a lot of people is over compression and making things loud. And, that loudness war is not a new thing. That's been around, since the record labels have been around. I think now people are starting to realize by listening to vinyl that maybe loud is not always better. And also there was a big thing that went around a couple of years ago where people saw that there was an unmastered version of a Metallica song on the game Rock Band. And they go, hey, wait a minute, this sounds better than what's on my CD. Why is that? Mm-hmm. And, thousands of people petitioned Metallica to remaster the record.
What does that mean? I'm not sure everybody understands what mastering a record means.
So that's kind of the last step of the process. You do your recording, and then you do your mixing, and then usually things get mastered after that. So that's kind
putting
of
it all together.
Yeah, it's kind of the final polish. I mean, in the traditional sense, mastering would be when you're mixing a record, you're taking all the instruments and you're making a cohesive song out of it. When you master it, you kind of take all the songs and make a cohesive record out of it, and make them all kind of sound the same. But a big part of the mastering for a lot of people is just making it loud, loud enough to compete with whatever environment you're in. If you're in the car or your music is in the background, we want to make it so that you can hear everything equally,
Does the mastering that you would do in the studio, the final product, really appreciably different than something I could do at home?
Mastering, it really kind of depends on the song and how the song was mixed, because sometimes people will bring me songs that are mixed in such a way that I can't really do much to it in the mastering anyway. Mm-hmm. But I'm of the opinion that mastering should kind of be a do no harm process. Mm-hmm. We're there to make sure that all the songs are level with each other and sound the same. But some people's mastering process just in some cases can be detrimental, and that's where we get into that loudness war thing.
But can't the mastered version always be amended, improved, changes made to it? Or once it's mastered,
Usually
is it
not.
done?
Yeah, usually it's done, and a lot of people will go back to the original mixes to you see a lot of remastered versions, especially on Spotify and things like that, or even CDs that came out where you'd have a remaster from something that was done in the 70s or 80s, and they remaster it. And sometimes they're better, sometimes they're not. I usually tend to listen to the original version because that's what I grew up with.
Who does the master copy belong to? The artist or the studio that put it together?
The studio usually never owns a master, but depending on who distributed it or licensed it or published it, it could belong to the artist if it's an independent artist, or it could belong to the record label. And there's countless people that went to battle over rights to masters of records.
Have any studios in St. Louis gone out of business because of this modernization of the equipment?
Well, plenty have gone out of business. I can't really attest to if that was the reason or not. We talk about Technisonic a bit, which is kind of an institution in the city. They were one of the oldest studios. I think it was like 80 years or something like that they had been around. I don't know if that was a factor or not for them, but there's plenty of studios that have come and gone, and it's an expensive business. I mean, just building a studio requires ridiculous amounts of money. And I'm not even talking about equipment. I'm just talking about building in the building. All the acoustic treatment and multiple layers of walls and all that stuff is not cheap.
Yeah, there's that word acoustic again, and clearly that's a very important factor in any of this.
Definitely.
Can you establish a kind of an acoustic, however we want to describe it, with this in your garage?
It all comes down to the original room itself and the dimensions of the room, because some rooms are make a good studio and some don't. If anybody saw the documentary Sound City, they go into how that was an old Vox amplifier factory, and they put a studio in it, and it just ended up sounding amazing just because, that's the layout of the room. But, I put a little home studio in my basement just so I can work on my own songs and stuff. It sounds horrible, and it's like there's nothing I can do about it because of the dimensions of the space. It's got a really short ceiling and all that.
And amateurs probably don't understand the engineering of acoustics very well, generally.
Generally not. It's a science. It's a very specific science.
What do you hope to accomplish with this video?
Well, honestly, I kind of already did, because I just wanted to make it, and that was fun. So in that respect, I accomplished what I wanted to accomplish. But you
have a story to tell as well.
Yeah. I'd like people to see it. I didn't get into it to make money or anything, and that was kind of what my ethos going into it. It was like, that's not my goal.
Well, is there a goal perhaps in just alerting people in the business to what's going on and alerting groups that want to get into the business that there's a different way to do it rather than doing it individually?
Yeah, definitely. And it's, a matter of kind of just making people aware of what's going on. And, people might want to get into the studio and think it's too expensive and they can't afford it. But, there's many, many ways to incorporate a recording studio into people's process. And I don't want people to always think, I have to start and finish a project in the studio and pay tens of thousands of dollars. That's not always the case.
You can bring in what you've done at home and work in the studio from that point.
I do,
and
it all the time.
that too would be a savings, because you wouldn't have the full time to be expended in the studio.
Definitely. I work with a lot of bands that may record stuff on their own and I'll mix it, or may just record the drums and I'll give them the drum tracks and they record everything else and then they bring it back and I mix it. There's all kinds of ways to slice it.
That's another form of the collaboration we talked about a little while ago.
Totally.
Well, Justin Fisher, thank you for telling us about this project of yours.
Thank you.
The producer and director of the Gateway Sound is the name of the documentary. It's showing Saturday at 4 o'clock at Brown Hall at Washington University. Thank you once again. Good luck to you. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio, 90.7 KWMU.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, providing more than 41,000 jobs in the production of wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details at choosewood.com.